Okay, certainly in the UK you could go out there and you could start talking to people about religion and atheism or politics, and most of them don't give a shiny shite about what you're talking about. They're not interested. They're more interested in why Arsenal's Eduardo received his punishment from UEFA. You know, they look at you gone out. I sometimes take a science book to work. People look at me like I'm deranged. Why would you be reading a science book? Why would you be interested in cosmology? Why would you be interested in biology? This is strange things to be interested in. What relevance can they have to our lives? I don't really have that perspective, but most people do. That's just the way it is. But most people have a perspective, have an argument, have a position on abortion. It's something that really gets people effervescing, isn't it? One way or the other. That's what I'm talking about in this video, abortion, my views on it. Okay, now it seems with the subject of abortion you've got to pick a camp, and certainly in the US likes these terms, don't they? Pro-life and pro-choice. They both carry a lot of baggage, don't they? The whole notion of them is that if you're pro-life, that means you don't think that people should have a choice. So if you're pro-choice, you don't think that life's important. This is the idea of it, I think. Very clever, very psychologically clever. But if I've got to pick one of those labels, then it's going to have to be pro-choice. Not because I like the label, but because I agree with the basic philosophy. But what are the arguments against this pro-choice? Well, one of the arguments is that aborting or having an abortion is murder, and that murder's wrong. We all agree that murder's wrong, but we don't all agree that murder's wrong, do we? We all agree that murder's wrong under certain conditions. Certainly if somebody's trying to kill you, and the only thing that you can do to defend yourself, most people would agree that under those conditions that murder is acceptable. That in a wartime, if there's a hostile aggressor attacking you, that murder is acceptable under those conditions. But we can't really justify abortion under those terms, can we? Because an unborn baby, a fetus, an embryo, a zygote is not a hostile aggressor. They've not done anything wrong. Or certainly not from my perspective. Perhaps if I was a Christian and I believed that we're all born sinful and wicked, I could make that kind of case, so in that respect they deserve to die. Certainly God seems to think so, because over 2/3 of zygotes never implant. They are spontaneously aborted without even giving us a chance to abort them. But that's kind of an aside. I'm not a Christian. I'm not going to make that argument. And that argument was a little bit tongue-in-cheek. I know no Christians actually make that argument. But it is an interesting argument, isn't it? I'm sure if Christians wanted abortion, that would be the argument they would make. So the point is then, I can't legitimise it as murder on these kinds of grounds. But there's two questions that we need to ask. Why do we have these views on murder in the first place? And does this really constitute murder? Well, on the first thing then, why do we have these things on murder? Why do we have these views on murder? Well, really it's for self-interest. That's why we've evolved these innate feelings and these empathetic feelings towards murder, and why we've codified these laws on murder. It's for our protection and the protection of those around us, those we are genetically related to. And yes, okay, so I'm not genetically related very closely to the guy next door, but by having that kind of rule, that kind of structure that I can't murder him, means that he has that kind of rule that he cannot murder me. It's very much in my interests to do that and to feel like that. Okay, just had to answer the phone there. I'm back now. So clearly none of these things apply to a ball of cells or to an embryo the same way as they apply to you and me. This is the point here. There are rules why I don't want to kill a neighbour and I don't want him to kill me. There's rules there's treaties of how to conduct a war even. We make these for our own interests because the boot might be on the other foot, very literally, and we want to be treated in a certain way. But that doesn't apply to a ball of cells. A ball of cells is never going to hold my life in its hands. So for those reasons, it's a very, very different circumstance. But is it even murder? Is it life? What do we constitute as life? We have, as human beings, we have this tendency to try and put ourselves in the shoes of everything, don't we? And how would I feel if I was this ball of cells? But it's a very, very simplistic way of looking at it. Does human life begin at the moment of conception? Well, that's a philosophical question more than anything else. I don't believe that some immaterial soul is implanted in that ball of cells. So when does life begin? Well, when does a pan of cold water on the stove become a pan of hot water? It gradually happens, doesn't it? And gradually that ball of cells turns into an embryo, turns into a fetus, gets to the point where it could sustain its life. Surely that's an important point. The point where you could sustain your life with the utmost medical intervention outside of the womb. Surely there's another cut-off point where it can sustain its life without medical attention outside of the womb. Surely the point of birth is a major cut-off point. These are all major cut-off points, but all along those points there is a continuum. Every moment of every day that ball of cells is becoming more and more human, until eventually there's a point where it would say, yes, that's definitely human, but it starts from a point where it definitely is just a ball of cells. The difficult question is where along that continuum we draw the line. And this is the second objection that people have, because they say, well, it's the thin end of the wedge. This is a great argument. Anytime anybody wants to do anything you don't want them to do, just stare them down and go, it's the thin end of the wedge. Because it's such a brilliant argument. But it's not. It's a crap argument, because you wouldn't do anything. You wouldn't allow people to drink at 18 or 21, because before you know it, 3-month-old babies are going to be downing a bottle of scotch. You know, you wouldn't allow anybody to do anything at any age, or you'd allow everybody to do everything at every age, because otherwise it's the thin end of the wedge. This is the problem. And this is the problem here. And it's the problem here because people start making ludicrous cases. Well, if we allow abortion at so many weeks, the next step is we'll allow abortion 2 days before the baby's due. We'll allow people, I heard recently somebody make a ludicrous case, well, we'll give parents a 90-day period, cooling off period, where their children can be murdered after they've been born. These are all thin end of the wedge arguments, but they're ludicrous, and history has shown that these thin end of the wedge arguments are ridiculous arguments, because we wouldn't be able to formulate 90% of our laws without them. We all have an innate sense that once an unborn baby gets to a certain point, we can really see that that is a human being, and that it started from a point where, take away your religious perspective and these ideas of a soul implanted into a single cell, that really isn't a human. A single cell doesn't suffer. You know, if you have a morning after pill and you try and dispose of that single fertilised cell, that zygote, you know, that zygote doesn't go through any kind of a trauma. It doesn't think, oh, I'm never going to get to live the life that I'd hoped to live. You know, what a tragedy, what a trash it is to annihilate in this kind of a way. That sounds like a Sylvia Plath poem. To annihilate in this kind of a way doesn't happen. So this thin end of the wedge argument is null and void. The argument that we have all the time is, where do we set this cut-off point? And I'm happy that this is debated. It's something we really need to debate, because we all have a slightly different opinion of what is a key point. You know, the key point for a lot of people is this idea of medical. The ultimate key point is the point of birth. That provides an ultimate stop. Bang, there. You never ever, however much you want to play the thin end of the wedge argument, we're never going to go past that point. But the point that perhaps most people are happy with is this point of utmost medical intervention. Once you're at that point where that baby could survive outside the womb, well then that becomes a bit of a moral dilemma, doesn't it? As medical intervention becomes better and better, there'll probably become a point where we'll say, well, that really isn't an acceptable point, and the reason it isn't an acceptable point is because we're down almost to a single cell, or we're before a single cell. We're down to a sperm and an egg, an unfertilised egg. We can take them all the way without even having a mother carry the baby at any point in its term. So to sum up then, short of this religious perspective of an immortal, immaterial soul being injected into that fertilised cell, that zygote, and it not being one of the 66 to 75% of such cells that God doesn't decide to abort, short of that perspective, which obviously isn't my perspective, there's no specific moral reason why we should not allow abortions under most circumstances. But we do have this argument, and it's a very, very legitimate debate, whether you're religious or not religious, as to where we set the terms. At what point is the cut-off? Forget about the thin end of the wedge. let's actually dissect the wedge the same as we do with everything else and make a reasonable, mature decision about when we are and when we're not going to allow abortion. If you're really religious, you've got a different perspective, don't have a fucking abortion. But let other people decide for themselves. Oh, and I should say one more thing. Thank you for watching.